Hello and welcome to Freedom from Fear, a German New Medicine podcast. I'm your host, Ashlee Newberry.
And I'm your other host, Abigail Puccioni. Please be aware that nothing discussed here on this podcast should be taken as medical advice.
Consult your trusted professionals and your own inner knowing before making any health decisions. Welcome back to another episode of Freedom from Fear. We're so excited to have you here. And today we'll be covering a topic about injuries and German New Medicine and how different types of conflicts can make you prone to injuries and how injuries can make you prone to conflicts. So take it away, Abigail.
So this is a really big, maybe I shouldn't say hot topic in the GNM world, but I feel like there's definitely a lot of disagreement about this, or at least the degree to which this exception is applicable. So as we've covered before in previous episodes, there's 3 exceptions to GNM, or as I should say, exceptions to what would be caused by a conflict shock or conflict activity when we're looking at, symptoms and disease. And so we have the poisoning, the malnutrition, and we've already covered those a bit in previous episodes. But now we're going to dive into the 3rd exception, which is injury. And this one I think can confuse people a bit because obviously if someone falls off the roof and shatters their leg or something, someone's going to be like, well, you're insane to think that, that wasn't caused by a conflict, obviously. And I would argue that, yeah, okay, if someone falls off the roof and, breaks their leg, that was purely an injury. However, what we deal with in our culture is so much chronic pain. And a lot of this chronic pain is blamed on, or even, like one time injuries like, oh, I tripped and sprained my ankle, right? Or I was in a car accident and I have whiplash and my neck hurts. Is that purely an injury? And so today we're going to dive into a lot of the nuance behind this and really unpack what is actually caused by purely injury versus like to what degree do conflicts play a role in the pain that we experience that we commonly attribute to injuries. And this is very common in the conventional medical system to, do diagnostic tests, to do some scans. And they're like, oh, well, you have, this herniated disc, right? And so obviously your pain must be related to this herniated disc, for example. So, and we're going to unpack this because Ashlee and I both have stories to share about herniated discs, actually.
Yep.
But yeah, I would say that there is definitely, though, a lot of disagreement in the GNM world about to what extent do we actually consider something purely an injury versus also considering, maybe conflicts did play a role in this. And so there's 2 main scenarios we're going to be looking at. So the first one is that the injury itself was a conflict shock event. Okay. So that moment in which you fell off the roof and broke your leg, that you experienced a conflict shock from that in that moment that then from that point forward affects your ability to heal. Because as we'll get into in a little bit, really any injury, particularly like a broken bone, for example, should only take 6 to 8 weeks to heal from start to finish. However, we are usually dealing with a lot of injuries out there and, today's day and age that just never seem to heal. Someone has an injury and it just takes them forever to heal, or they never really heal. They go to all these therapists and they get all these scans and they're like, well, I don't know what's wrong with you because this should, take about this long to heal. And you're left with 30 years of chronic pain and being stuck in this cycle of chronic pain that you're always blaming on an like initial injury that perhaps happened when you were younger. But what we're going to dive into today is, well, to what extent is it actually still the injury, or was there a conflict from the injury itself? So like I said, the first scenario is that the injury moment was a conflict shock in and of itself, in which point, the injury never really heals and finishes out the healing phase because thinking about the injury and devaluing yourself in terms of the injury and, oh, now I have a bad back, I have a bad ankle.
I can't do XYZ
Right.
because of my injury.
Sure. or getting a diagnosis from a
Mm-hmm.
doctor, right? Like, oh, you have a shattered, ankle. And someone in that moment, particularly if they think, say if they're a soccer player, I'll never be able to play soccer again, or oh no, my ankles will always be weak, and they start to view themselves as, a victim, and they have weak ankles, right? And all these stories that go along with that diagnosis or that injury
Mm-hmm.
event. So we're going to look more at that. And then the second scenario is that conflict activity, particularly recurring chronic conflict activity, a hanging healing, or just prolonged conflict active phase, would create essentially imbalances and compensations in the body from continued cell loss, which is weakening the tissue, and that can make you more injury prone. So, again, going back to exceptions, for an exception to truly be an exception in GNM, it would have to affect everyone equally. So, let's say that we have a situation where there's a tragic car accident in which someone gets completely crushed. Their legs get crushed. They're, sitting in the car, and where the other car smashes into them, it just shatters their legs, right? Well, if we recreated that scenario, right, which would be very unethical to do in a formal research setting, of course, but theoretically, imagine for a moment that you could recreate that. Every person in that car with the same force being applied at the same angle, etc., should have the same result of having just absolutely crushed bones, right? So with a certain amount of force, there will be obviously an injury that will, result from that. So that's going to be like, purely injury scenario. However, imagine a car accident in which someone sitting in that seat had very severe osteoporosis, which we know is from prolonged conflict activity, particularly
Mm-hmm.
being the conflict active phase where we have cell loss in the bones. So when the bones are, being essentially broken down like that, and they're losing mass, that there's cell loss going on, then that person, it would take less force to crush their bones than
Yep.
someone who did not have that prolonged conflict activity going on in the body. If you kind of, if this is making sense, hopefully it is. So, Ashlee, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about, self-devaluation conflicts in general and the biological purpose of them, or if you want to add on to anything I just said?
Yeah, well, I wanted to give a quick visual. So, I don't know why this example just came to mind, but I also work with kids a lot, so some weird examples sometimes pop into my head. But if you think about like a stick that's your bone, and like the conflict activity, the cell loss, like let's say you're trying to whittle a stick, right? Or you're trying to or chop a piece of wood, and you try the axe, you try to hit it at the same spot every time so then it will break. And that's actually very similar what's going on with the self-devaluation during the conflict active phase. You're having the cell loss at the same spot over and over and over again. And just like you're trying when you're chopping wood and using an axe, you're trying to hit the same point every time so that it does break. But, unfortunately in the body, like Abigail was just saying, if you have a history of self-devaluation in the bones or osteoporosis, um, that is kind of like the axe is just chopping that piece of wood, and then the bone is getting weaker in that spot. So then, you would need less force to for the bone to break. Just another example visually.
Mhm. I
Um,
like that.
yeah, I also love camping, so
I
nature
think
examples.
people, they also, I mean, I know so many people that say, oh, I just always roll my ankle, and it's usually one or the other, right? I always roll my
Mm-hmm.
left ankle. I'm just clumsy. I just trip, and just so happen to, get injured kind of thing. We have to ask, is that so random? Or is there persistent conflict activity going on at some level in your tissue that's actually weakening that tissue, that's creating these imbalances, compensations in the body? And I mean, look at all the different types of therapy, like biomechanical therapy, chiropractic care. I personally love something called muscle activation techniques therapy that, they're working on like the brain to muscle connection, activating,
Mm-hmm.
essentially a band-aid fix for long-standing compensations that are going on that are creating very real chronic pain. And so we have to ask though, well, what's the root cause of that? What was
Mm-hmm.
the initial cause of, why someone they're like, oh yeah, your pelvis is all twisted to the right because your left shoulder is tight and that's pulling you to, into torsion this way. Well, that all makes sense. And I think it's very accurate and true, but what was going on in your body, adaptation wise, that led to that, torsion, right? Or to those
Mm-hmm.
compensations that's pulling and actually affecting your biomechanical structure, the structure of your joints and your bones and how you walk and how you move. And so even stuff like, right, scoliosis, there's a conflict shock that occurred
Mm-hmm.
in utero that leads to that adaptation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, on this episode where the heart of what we're trying to get to is that it's not usually random. Injuries
Mhm.
are not. And what's different though about self-devaluation conflicts, which are any conflict that essentially you don't feel good enough in that area of the body, which can affect the blood, the fat layers, the muscles, or the bones. Any one of those can be a self-devaluation conflict. And the purpose of these conflicts, particularly, it's in German medicine, it's termed as like the luxury group. And the biological purpose doesn't happen until the healing phase is completed, which means that just like we were saying about the bones, the conflict activity where you have the cell loss, that's not, I mean, that's not the purpose of it, right? The purpose happens when you resolve it and your bones, your muscles get stronger. So you're more resilient, more able to handle a similar type of conflict in the future because you're literally physically stronger. I mean, even Western medicine says this, like, when you break a bone and it heals, the bone is usually stronger than before it was broken. And
Yeah.
they've done tests on that. And what's different with other types of conflicts that the biological purpose actually happens during the conflict active phase versus at the end of the healing is like a good example would be a marking conflict. So you still have cell loss in the conflict active, similar to self-devaluation, but the purpose is to widen the ureters so you can have more urine to mark your territory. So the purpose actually happens during the conflict active phase, whereas with self-devaluation conflicts or the luxury group, the purpose isn't revealed until you're like through all of it, until like the very end, where then your bones, your muscles are stronger because you've had the tissue build up again, and then you're physically stronger to handle the next conflict,
Yeah.
essentially.
And I think a good visual for this perhaps is take a dilapidated building, an old rickety house that's kind of falling down, it's not a not a very good house, right? Well, what would you do? If the house is kind of, beyond repair, then you can think of this program as being like tearing that house down to build something new from the ground up,
Mm-hmm.
right? A big, beautiful new building. This is again, in a very primal way, what your body's trying to do. The purpose of this program, as Ashlee was saying, is to have cell loss in the conflict active phase to kind of, be the bulldozer tearing down the building. What you're perceiving is not good enough. If you're, and again, this is not just in terms of you viewing a part of your body as not good enough, you devaluing yourself in terms of a part of your body, which it definitely can be, but it can also be very metaphorical. So a common example is shoulder any adaptations in the shoulder area are typically self-devaluations in terms of relationships, where
Mm-hmm.
you are, yeah, devaluing yourself in terms of usually like a romantic relationship, right? Or if it's, on your partner side, or the adaptations around the pelvis and hip area is typically, and there are a few flavors to this, but that's typically more a sexual type self-devaluation. Um, and again, there are many different flavors and possibilities and ways that this can look, which we're not really going to dive into in this episode, but you have that cell loss in the conflict active phase to kind of break down what your psyche's thinking is like, okay, not good enough. And then for the purpose of then in the healing phase, when you resolve the conflict, it will build the tissue up as stronger than before so that you
Mm-hmm.
can better handle the weight of the world, right? You can better handle the situations in your life that you're currently perceiving yourself as not good enough or not able to handle.
Yeah, exactly. Um, well, did you want to tell your story first and then I'll share mine?
Oh, sure. Okay. So my self-evaluation story. And of course, this is something that I, for many years, thought was purely an injury and purely from, so I was also diagnosed with a genetic disorder called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is the hypermobile version of that. And, I do have very hypermobile joints, which I'm sure was due to conflict activity in the womb, right? Just the way that my body developed. But I had chronic pain that started when I was in high school. I was 16.
Mm.
And it happened when and again, I thought that this was an injury moment, but I was essentially flipping myself into a back bend. I was doing some contortionism stuff. I was very into ballet and I was training for this one part that I gotten for the Nutcracker performance. And it was
Ooh.
the Arabian part for anyone familiar with that. And there's a lot of kind of contortionism involved with that. You have to be very flexible and I was probably due to my hypermobility and all that, but I was, flipping myself into a back bend and I felt this sudden sharp pain in my spine. And I think I heard like a noise too. And I was like, oh my gosh, like something really bad just happened. And it was immediately like all this pain and I remember it was a really scary moment. And I'm positive that that moment in and of itself was also a conflict shock. But I always thought of that as strange, though, that, I've flipped into back bends so many other times in my life and never had an injury from that
Mm.
same motion. And then all of a sudden, when I'm, 16, I'm doing it again. And of course, I blamed it on the fact that, oh, I was doing it without being warmed up. I hadn't properly
Mm.
warmed up my muscles and that's
Yep.
how I got injured, right? That was the story I was telling myself. Well, that started about 10 years of incredibly severe back pain, which I mean, I was, suicidal at one point. It was really, really intense. And I actually had a doctor when I was, I think, because I mean, I dealt with this, like I said, for several years and I tried. Oh my gosh, I tried everything out there. PRP injections where they take out your blood and spin it and put it back in, and ozone injections and
Mm-hmm.
ozone therapy. And I mean, I traveled to see some of the top therapists, biomechanical therapists in the country, physical therapists, chiropractors, massage therapists, you name it. And nothing really helped. So I went to see all these doctors. I actually almost even had surgery at one point, but they ended up not, they said no to doing surgery on me because they said, look, where you have your disc herniations, because I had two, I had one at L4, L5 and L5S1. And, so when you're looking at the scan, it seems to be that, oh, okay, when you flipped into that back bend, that caused these two disc herniations, and that's the source of your pain. But because I had a lot of also sciatica and numbness and nerve pain and all this, stuff that we just kind of assumed was the herniated discs.
Mm.
Well, then they were telling me that where I was experiencing the pain and the types of nerve pain and the locations of the pain was not actually consistent with those two disc herniations.
Mm.
And so
Interesting.
And so they're like, well, we can't do surgery because there's a really good chance that we could do this disc, back fusion surgery or whatever, and you would still have the exact same pain. And so at
Mm.
that point, I started wondering, and I mean, talk about additional conflict shocks from this. I mean, it completely changed my life. I couldn't sit for more than 15 minutes at a time without being in severe pain. I couldn't go out to eat with my friends. I couldn't drive anywhere. I remember I had to move back in with my parents for a long time, and my parents would have to drive me everywhere, and I'd have to lay in the back of the car if it was
Wow.
going to be more than a 15-minute drive. So I remember going to see this one really supposedly really good biomechanical therapist up in Michigan, actually. And it was like a 5-hour drive, and I had to lay in the back of the car the whole way. And I was just, I mean, it was horrible. I actually got like addicted to pain meds at one point. It was a really long, tough journey. And I remember another definite conflict shock moment. One doctor actually told me, he said, well, with the way your spine looks, because, oh, yeah. And then they said, I have degenerative disc disease. And I had all this, breakdown in my spine. My spine, they said, looked like a really old person's spine and all this
Yeah.
stuff. And so, I mean, talk about self-evaluation. I was thinking, wow, my back is completely ruined. My back is useless. Wow, my life is over. Like I'll just be in pain forever. I mean, it's very depressing. And I remember a doctor told me, he said, yeah, you essentially just said you'll be in pain for the rest of your life. And
Mm.
he said, you'll for sure need back surgery when you're by the time you're in your 40s or something like that. You're going to be this is basically you'll have to deal with this, and probably from his perspective, he's being real with me, right? And he's, wanting to set my expectations accordingly. But I remember just being completely shocked and caught off guard in that moment. And
Mm.
lo and behold, I had several more years of really intense chronic back pain. So for me, oh, I should talk about the conflict though that I think led to that tissue adaptation occurring that led me to having an injury, right? Why, when, doing a back bend, a movement that I had done all the time, all of a sudden that movement triggered like an injury, right? So how did I actually get the herniated disc? And I do think that, there was a moment in that moment, the physical, just from the physics of it, flipping into the back bend, there was a force. But
Yep.
what caused that time to be different from all the others? And I know for a fact I was a pre-professional ballet dancer. I don't know if you all know anything about ballet, but it is a field that is ripe with self-devaluation opportunities. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember my eating was very disordered, always being told that, never good enough, never thin enough, never, you know, um, yeah, never good enough. Really. I mean, I don't remember the whole time I was a ballet dancer ever really getting like a positive comment. Like, oh,
Mm.
that looks really good, or you're doing a really good job. Or like,
Wow.
it was always like, oh, you need to do better. It's never good
Like
enough. You
fix
suck.
this. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Mm.
Just extremely degrading field to be in. So I already know that I'm sure my conflict shock that led to that adaptation of the discs and my spine breaking down. I was also diagnosed with osteoporosis at a very young age. I think I was diagnosed with pre-osteoporosis when I was like 16, and then which was around the same time. And then full on osteoporosis by the time I think I was 21. So I was having a
Mm.
lot of cellular breakdown, cell loss in my bones. And I think obviously in my spine and my discs, my connective tissue, those are all self-evaluation. So
Yep.
I know for a fact that that injury was not random. It was not just an injury. Now, looking back through the lens of GNM, I see how my probably several self-devaluation conflicts that were playing into this weakened my tissue to the point where I got injured doing a movement that I used to be able to do without getting injured. So that, looking back, for sure, I mean, so much self-devaluation going on. And then of course, the injury itself created, it's this catch 22, right? It's like this nasty cycle of then once we have, so we have conflict activity that leads to an injury. And then, the injury leads to more conflict activity. It's usually a conflict shock moment in and of
Yep.
itself. And then
Yep.
also being told by the doctor, you're going to be in pain for the rest of your life. We don't know what's wrong with you. There's like really no hope for you. Hearing that over and over, from I get my hope up seeing a new therapist and then it, wouldn't help. I mean, that was just a huge, nasty cycle of continued self-devaluations. Like, I should be young and healthy. Why at, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, all the way up to 26 years of age, I'm like, my back looks worse than that of a, 70-year-old, right? And like, why? I mean, and then so much self-pity. Oh my gosh, of like, oh, poor me, like my life is over. I'm going to be in pain forever. Like, this sucks. Victimhood. I mean, swimming in a pool of victimhood. I mean, so, you can see how that led to this perpetuation of this cycle. Um, and I would say that once I got into holistic health, started to feel like, okay, I'm taking my health back into my own hands. I did find a really great therapist that helped address some of the, underlying imbalances from years of conflict activity, right?
Mm.
So I got myself a therapist that I trusted, that I felt supported by, that, at least wasn't making things worse, right? And then after, getting some wins, some small wins through that, I started working out with a personal trainer. And what's that doing? I mean, yeah, there's an element that I'm making my muscles stronger to help
Mm-hmm.
support my body through this, healing phase, but I'm also like believing in myself more. I'm stepping
Mm-hmm.
into like, oh, I'm going here with the intention of getting stronger. Like, I can do this. So you can see how part of the resolution of this too is doing these things that you help you revalue
Revalue.
yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's so, I mean, I think we can get into another episode where we talk more about how to resolve self-devaluation. But the main point with sharing this story is that what I had assumed was an injury that just would never heal was actually a cycle of chronic conflict activity and self-devaluation. And I think that that's a really important point because it would be very easy to stick with the narrative of, oh, I just have a bad back and I had this injury when I was 16 years old and it just never healed. Like, excuse me, but we know through knowing GNM that the body is always trying to heal. It's always trying to return to homeostasis. It's
Mm-hmm.
always trying to get you back to, it's trying to restore the tissue. And if it's not doing that, there's a reason why. There's a
Mm-hmm.
reason why if you're stuck in a cycle of, conflict activity. And so that was my my self-evaluation story that now I realize, oh my gosh, and now I'm like pain-free, and which is amazing. I can sit for several hours without any pain. I mean, it's a night and day difference from like 3 years ago. And I think for me, my final part of that like healing was discovering GNM and understanding, oh my gosh, there's nothing wrong with my back. And I think this is also an important
Mm-hmm.
point about herniated discs is that, and actually my dad's a neuroradiologist, conventional doctor. And he has told me before that he said, well, if you were to take like an average person off the street and do an MRI of their back, he said they would probably have at least one or two herniated discs, even if they have no pain and no symptoms. So, just because someone has something showing up on imaging does not mean that that needs to be causing pain necessarily. So, and also there's, a reason for herniated discs. I mean, there can be, with enough force, sure, it could be an injury, but often there's tissue adaptation going on that makes it easier for, say, something like picking up a small child that would cause an injury. Whereas logically, we know, okay, picking up a small child, that's not enough to really cause an injury, right? But it will
Yeah, on its
seem that
own.
way when there's been that adaptation going on in that area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, such a cool story. And yeah, I wanted to ask you, so when did you start doing ballet? Like was it at 16 or like what was happening before that kind of led to the self-devaluation or even put you in a position during ballet to be kind of more prone to the self-devaluation even before your injury, if that makes sense.
Right. That's actually a really good point. So I started doing ballet. Actually, the reason I started doing ballet was because I had been in an accident, a horseback riding accident, where I fell off a horse and had a brain injury from that. Um, and I ended up paralyzed on the left side of my body, which
Wow.
again was that purely injury from falling off the horse and the impact that caused the bleed in the brain, or was there some level of conflict activity going on? I mean, we don't need to get into that here because I don't think I've actually fully unpacked that for myself. um and there might not be like a good way to know definitively, but that was definitely a source of more than one conflict shock. Was that the moment of, getting rushed to the hospital and the ambulance, totally paralyzed, couldn't move on my left side. I think I remained paralyzed for like a few days before I started to get the motion back because the brain bleed kind of just started healing up naturally in the brain. I didn't necessarily need an intervention, thankfully, but I was in the hospital for a while and going through a
Mm,
lot of rehab. And I mean, talk about self-evaluation. I felt so horrible about myself. Like, oh my gosh, my body's so weak and broken. And, other
mm,
kids can fall. I was 10 years old. Other kids can fall off a horse and be totally fine. But why am I paralyzed? So there was definitely a lot of that going on. And then I was told by, doctors that I couldn't ride horses again, or at least not for a very long time because it was too risky in case I would fall off again. And they even said, like, oh, well, your brain's weaker, and so at least for the next year, when your brain's in this weakened state, which, why would they say that? You have to be really careful. You can't do any contact sports. You can't ride horses. You can't do anything in which you could risk falling down
just
or
wear a
getting
helmet
hurt.
all the time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they were,
Mm,
and of course, my parents, very cautious, enforced this and, listening to the doctors, right? And I think that was a huge source of me believing this story of my fragility and
mm,
that, oh, I'm weaker than the average person. So as part, because I was still weaker on my left side too, like I was, getting that strength back, which took a while. And I started doing ballet as a form of rehab. I started doing ballet and piano, because my parents like, oh, that can help retrain like the brain connections and the
yeah.
coordination, all of that, right? So they felt like doing ballet and piano would be good. And I had a friend that wanted to do ballet, and I did want to do it, so I started getting into that when I was like around 10 years old. And so there was always this sense though that doing ballet, like there was something I needed to prove, right? Like
Mm.
I didn't want anyone else to know about my accident because I was so embarrassed by it, because they'll think I'm, weak, I'm weird, something's wrong with my brain. Maybe they'll think I'm not intelligent. Maybe, because in the hospital
Yeah.
they did all these IQ tests on me, which came back totally fine. But, I was like, well, why are they, testing my smartness, right? My intelligence. Like it was almost like very insulting to me. And I did not want to be viewed as a sick kid, a sick kid in a hospital that
Mm.
needs they would have to help me walk around because I couldn't walk fully on my own, and they'd have to put this belt around me and kind of
Oh yeah,
hold
the
me
gait
up. And
belt. Hmm.
yeah, and it was very it was very shameful and very like I just felt so icky
Humiliating.
to me. Yeah, humiliating, that's the
Hmm.
word. Which, talk about self-evaluation conflicts. So was it the ballet or did it start even before the ballet? Right. And I don't know for sure. It could have been the accident. I don't know, but I do know that in the years that followed getting into ballet, and then I got, to be quite good at it and, very high level, partly because, I had to prove myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I extreme perfectionist with that, with schoolwork, with everything, because I had to show people that I was normal, that I was better than normal, right? I had to, that was my way of coping with that. And so anyway, that's hopefully
Well,
that answers your question.
yeah, well, and I think too, like as a child, and we talk about this in an interview that we did with Annie, that, as a child, and especially as a child that was in the hospital, you didn't have the tools or like the logic to like fully understand.
Mm,
It wasn't like they weren't doing this to try to prove that you were stupid or there was something wrong with you. But as a child, you don't have the logic to kind
mhm,
of see it that way. We take it upon ourselves that, oh, that there's something wrong. There's something wrong with me, that I'm broken. I need to be fixed. Um, or yeah, I need to prove my value and my worthiness. And I mean, I found that with self-devaluation conflicts with myself personally, and like any clients I've worked with, it's like there tends to be this flavor of I need to prove myself because
mhm.
I don't believe I'm good enough at this kind of existential level.
Yeah.
And it shows up, in all these different self-devaluation symptoms, which, like Abigail said, we're going to do a whole nother episode on just that because there's lots more to cover.
Oh yeah. It's a big
um,
one.
but yeah, that's really interesting about the horse accident. I don't remember you mentioning that before, or maybe briefly to me. And yeah, so yeah, that would definitely set you up for all these conflicts. And
Mm,
this is just something to ponder for anyone who's listening. But thinking about, why then, ballet, which was something that, was supposed to be helpful and trying to kind of do this fun way of, rehab essentially, um, then that's still was kind of setting you up for more self-devaluation conflicts, which is just super interesting to think about. Like, why are we even drawn to certain things? I think is a lot of based on our conflicts and, our personal history and what we've experienced and the perceptual lens that we've experienced things through. And then, like how we then operate in our lives, and even, what fields we choose to go into. And yeah, not really for this episode, but just an interesting thing to think about, that like
yeah.
our personalities and the things that we're interested in, like a lot of that comes back to the conflicts, and then how our behaviors adapt to for even our interests. And I am personally very grateful that you resolved this so we can do the podcast. Because I'm like, you couldn't even sit up for 15 minutes. Like, man,
I wouldn't
that's
be if I was still running that program, I would not be able to sit here recording
yeah,
this podcast,
yeah.
so I feel
She's
extremely
not laying
grateful.
down, by the way.
Yeah, no, I'm not laying down, I'm not standing, I'm actually sitting. And yeah, I think that also something I wanted to touch on is that a lot of people in the GNM world, perhaps more at the one end of the extreme of the spectrum, maybe more GNM purists, we could say, they attribute anything like a herniated disc or anything to purely conflict activity. Whereas I think it's important to hit the nuance that there is, for a lot of things, there is an element of injury, right? There's a moment that kind of like, you feel something, your back goes out, or you move the wrong way and it's, all this pain, right? Like, or, flipping into a back bend and, I herniated some discs from that motion, but that's not the full story. There
Mm-hmm.
is stuff going on that creates that weakens the tissue, right? Whether that's the bone, the ligaments, the tendons. I mean, these are all related to self-devaluation conflicts, the muscles, all this stuff. And so you have this weakened tissue that is more injury prone. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that's one of the biggest points I'm trying to illustrate here, because I was doing a very extreme motion. Most people are not doing contortionism. And, I was in a very physically demanding activity. Ballet
Yeah.
was, there's a lot of injuries in ballet. And I guess I'm trying to show how, that one dancer that keeps, twisting her ankle, right? Doing the same moves as everyone else. There's conflict activity going on that's affecting that tissue. Like it's not just a straight up injury event and no conflict involved.
Right, because then, like we illustrated earlier, if it was just purely injury, then every, dancer, ballet, I don't know what that term is, um,
Every dancer doing the same move would have
would
the
have
same
the same
injury. Yeah, yeah.
injury, but they
Mhm.
don't, right?
Right. But I think
Um,
this is also pretty mainstream knowledge though too, is that, well, and that's why people go to physical therapy, oh, well, I have to do my TheraBand exercises for my ankles. I have to strengthen my ankles, right? So the question, I mean, we know that there is an element that doing strengthening exercises will help, but why is that? Why was it weak in the first place?
mhm.
And so I think, strengthening can be a really good way to help build up the tissue, but that's not enough in and of itself if you're running a biological program that's creating, tissue breakdown.
Yeah, that still overrides any
Yeah.
physical therapy or working out or, anything that you're practically doing. If you haven't resolved a conflict, then
Mhm.
that stuff can support you. But if you're not also working on the underlying cause,
Yeah.
then that, any therapies or even chiropractic or physical, like any of those things are only going to help to a certain degree if you're not also addressing, why am I having these problems? Like what's behind that door that's causing
Hmm.
me to have these, this pain or this, different symptoms um, that you may be experiencing. So, yeah. Well, I have a interesting story that I'd like to share today. So as some of you may know, last year I was in a pretty major car accident last February, and I ended up having a cervical disc herniation and a lumbar disc herniation and a bad concussion. And so many lessons from all of this. And I'm so, so grateful to already have had the knowledge of German medicine, and not just in my head, but embodying it in my day to day, because I think that my healing, outlook or journey would have looked um, just a lot more drab in general.
Oh yeah. More
Um,
drawn out, I'm sure
yeah.
too.
And I didn't go to any medical practitioners. Like I just went to a chiropractor because I'm like, I didn't want to set myself up for more of those conflict shocks,
Yeah.
if that was, possible. um, and yeah, especially in the last few months, I worked with a lawyer and stuff, and so I couldn't talk about it during that case, which probably actually helped me because I couldn't just like go on social media and complain about it and be like, I'm a victim, blah blah blah.
Yep.
But I've asked myself a lot of these same questions, like, why was my cervical and lumbar spine affected, and why wasn't my thoracic spine affected, or my hips, or something else? Because I was T-boned on the driver's side, my car was totaled, but like there was no like smushing of the car into my body. Like I
Mhm.
was able to get out of the car by myself and stuff at the accident. But like we were talking about earlier, if it was just purely from the accident, then, after 6 to 8 weeks, I should have been fine. But I
Mhm.
wasn't. I had a lot of chronic pain last year, mostly low back. The cervical stuff, cervical spine really resolved pretty quickly. And but the funny thing about the cervical spine, and I'll get into the lumbar spine. But the cervical spine is all about feeling not smart enough, right? Like Abigail just described this earlier. And essentially feeling like you need to prove your intelligence. And um and then because I had the concussion, I was literally stupid. Like I couldn't really think properly. I couldn't problem solve. Like even the planning part of my brain, it was just like turned off. I could even in my mind, the next day did not even exist. It was super
Yes.
weird. Because I normally like love planning and having things to look forward to, or just kind of like maybe like planning my week, but it was just like in my brain nothing past the day I was living in existed. And like so it was almost like my worst fear came true, that literally all this cellular adaptation about not wanting to be seen as stupid or not intelligent, and then with concussion it was like, oh, I'm literally stupid, and I know I'm stupid, and I know other people know I'm stupid. it was just it was really challenging, and I mean it's sometimes funny but mostly challenging because I'm like, oh, okay, this lesson, like didn't want to learn this way. And I'm seeing, and especially like looking back now that I'm out of the post-concussive syndrome, and I'm thinking properly, and I can problem solve, and I can just I feel a lot more myself than I did most of last year. And I look back and I'm like, how many times have I felt like that before the accident? That I felt like I needed to prove my intelligence. I mean, even in nursing school, there was a lot of competition, and just trying to prove that I was smart enough, that I was good enough. And I mean, even all the way back to like grade school and high school, like I was a straight A student. I was first chair in band, like in the top choir. And like I was always trying to prove to myself and others that I was good enough,
Yeah.
because I didn't actually believe it, right? Which is like why I was talking about the behaviors earlier. That why are we the way we are? And
Right.
so it's just kind of hilarious and ironic that then from the car accident, then I had to work through mentally and psychologically that, like, okay, I am actually stupid, and I know I'm stupid because I can't think properly.
Mhm.
Um, and I had to work through that, and a lot of layers of this feeling unworthy, and I didn't realize how much of my value and my worthiness as a person I had put into the bucket of, well, I'm intelligent, so at least I have that. And so like that was taken
Yeah.
away, and I had to revalue myself from this place of like, it doesn't matter that I can't think right now. Like that does not determine my value, and my intelligence is not the whole of who I am. And it's okay. And because I knew the concussion wasn't going to be, or I hoped it wasn't going to be like long-term effects, like
Right.
um and so it made it a little bit easier, like the injury component, because I knew, or I thought at least, that there was going to be an end to it at
Mhm.
some point.
Yeah.
But it was really hard, and I had to reconcile that part of my personality that I valued very highly, and it was just gone. And so to revalue myself at this more basic level of just like my value is limitless, just for being born, just for being me. Like I don't have to prove anything, or do anything, or like show up for people in a certain way to like prove my value and my worth, but it's just inherently true just because I am. And unfortunately I had to learn that lesson in a very painful way. Um
Mhm. Yeah.
but it was like a really deep lesson, because most of my life, like way before that point, there was a lot of needing to prove. I mean, even in my family, and I'm the oldest, all my siblings are younger. So there's like the oldest child, um, and piece of it too. And so letting go of all of that was so freeing because I'm like, oh, there's nothing to prove.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just a thought or just like a concept, but it was like I like felt it in my body, and it was like this the way I live and the way I am has completely changed. Since the car accident, like I'm a very, very different person for the better. Didn't feel like it at the time. It's like, um, one of my friends was like trying to tell me only a few days after the accident, he was like, "Oh, like this is happening for you, not to you." And I was like, I couldn't hear it at that time because I was like, come on, like this just happened. I'm in like a lot of pain. I can't think. I can barely make my bed, can't make food. Like it was like, yeah, no, I wasn't able to see it at that time. But now that I am seeing it this way, and I have worked through, a lot of the conflicts from the accident and the injuries, it's like, okay, going back to, what's the point of these, with the self-evaluation? It's to be stronger once you complete the program,
Right.
so that you are more resilient, like physically and, psychologically, emotionally, to better handle those types of conflicts. And yeah, it's just wild.
It really is.
So wild.
So what about the lumbar?
Yes. So I also had a disc herniation in the lumbar spine, and um, that one was a little bit more. The injury itself was definitely more intense, and I had a lot of pain, and it just made it hard to do anything. I mostly lived my life from my bed for probably
Mhm.
about six months. Um, or the bathtub. I did take some client calls from the bathtub because I
I
was
love that.
like, okay, well, I can only like sit around in my bed for so long. So like, oh, let's just change environments like a little bit, but something that was still supportive. So I was
Mm.
mostly in bed for the bath um for a while. And I know that um it made it hard to do anything. And so I'm sure that I had multiple conflicts around just the injury itself and the pain of not being able to live my life. Like I could barely make my bed, and I would be in so much pain just trying to do that, that it was like then I just wanted to get back in bed. So it was like, or going and doing laundry, like any bending over, or like going
Mm.
in the kitchen and cooking food, like standing for a long time. Like I basically, like any one position for long amounts of time was really hard besides laying down. And so
Yeah,
I
I feel that.
I lived a lot of my life from my bed. I would eat
Mm.
in bed, which some people may think is gross, but it was what I had to do to just kind of survive. And I don't have family in Texas where I live, and so I had to get really, really comfortable asking for help and support.
Mm.
And the flavor of the lumbar spine, for the self evaluation is a feeling unsupported, but what that means is that I devalued myself for how much support that I needed.
Yeah. Mm.
And so I I I had to get over that. So I was like, well, I literally can't, like, I can't go to the store by myself because my car was totaled, so I didn't have a car for a while. Um I didn't have a car for like 8 months, which was really challenging to just get around Austin. And because of the concussion, public transportation was overwhelming
Mm.
to me. So I didn't really do that. Um, and right, so like I needed someone to take me to the grocery store or help me cook food. I had friends come over and help me do laundry and um, like bring over food for me, like take me to appointments.
Yeah.
And I got really good at asking for help. And if someone said no, I just asked someone else because I really needed whatever that support was. And I know in the past that, especially like growing up in my house, that I felt like my when I did ask for help or I did ask for support, my needs were not met usually anyway. So I kind of stopped asking, just kind of kept shrinking, or like would only ask for, 1 out of 10 for my needs to be met, even as like a young child.
Hmm.
And because I'm like, well, they're not getting met anyways, and feeling like, oh, I'm too much,
Yeah.
which is this conflict, feeling like the amount of support and help that I need is not being reciprocated. And so then you stop asking. You stop I mean, I felt like I just kind of shrunk, not like physically, but energetically, that I was just like, oh, I'll
Right.
just become the smallest version of myself and lower all my needs and expectations so that I'm not too much for anyone else. But that didn't solve the problem because then I'm still not still not getting my needs met. And so to flip that story after the accident and just, I mean, my community in Austin and, my online community, my family, my good friends here, like really stepped up and in ways that I really wasn't anticipating. And then other people that I expected, which expectations are, setting you up for conflict. Uh,
For
um,
sure.
other people that I thought or assumed would show up for me didn't. And and that was hard too. So I really like found out, okay, who my real friends are and who's, capable of showing up in the way that I needed. I'm not saying that the people that didn't, that, they did anything wrong, but also everyone's going through their own life and their own stuff. Um,
Right.
but it was just such a testament of the community I've built here, but then also just my ability to keep asking for what I needed, which I had gotten in the opposite habit for so much of my life, to then literally I have to ask until I get the need met, even if that's 5, 10 people that, I need a ride to this appointment. And if you say no, I'm just going to ask the next person. And to like know at like the core of my being that I deserve to be supported just
Hmm.
because I exist, and that someone saying no isn't a personal reflection on me, or isn't a reason to devalue myself,
Yeah.
no longer a reason because they say no. So freeing,
Yeah.
because
So freeing.
it's not personal, and it usually isn't. But when we are seeing situations and in our life through the lens of the self-devaluation, it makes it hard to not take things like that personally, because we already feel at this basic level not good enough.
Yeah.
um and so to just kind of flip that script, and instead of being always the person that is helping everyone else, supporting everyone else, and like I couldn't be that person. I was the one who needed the help and support, and I got really good at receiving without feeling bad or guilty. And I was like, wow, this is such a different like way to live my life that I never did, really, or not to the degree that I am now. And so, going back to the lumbar spine, it didn't resolve after 6 to 8 weeks. Like I kept having these flare-ups of pain. And but what was really interesting is paying attention to the subtleties I could almost tell what was like more from like the conflict activity resolution versus like the specific disc that was herniated. And I was like, oh, this is so fascinating because there was a slight difference in the sensation, in like, the exact location of the pain. And I just had to keep reminding myself that like it was okay to ask for help. And I also didn't feel I didn't have to wait until I absolutely was in dire need. Like I asked before I was in that place,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
I've never done in my life. I've always been very independent
Yes.
and felt like I had to do a lot of my life myself, just from my personal history and growing up experience, and not really feeling like I had people in my corner. And so, to have that change, and then now to see it on a bigger scale in my life where, I'm thankfully not in that place anymore, but to see how there's so many people in my life, whether I know them or not. Like I'll ask strangers for help.
Mm.
Like I asked someone when I was parking in downtown Austin. This was a few months ago, and it was like a one-way street, and I had to park on the left side of the one-way street, which is, opposite of normal parallel parking. And there was these two guys walking, and I rolled my window down, and I was like, "Hey, can you help me park for a second?" Like,
Yeah.
and they're like, "Oh, sure, like, no problem." And so it's like this whole new perspective of seeing that, okay, the world's not out to get me, and that, these injuries in the accident were actually there to help me learn these lessons that, maybe I wouldn't have been able to learn from a different situation. Um, and that, like we were saying earlier, with like the impact of an injury, like at the moment, like it qualifies for another conflict shock.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Or not even
and yeah, go ahead.
for not even just that injury moment itself, but also when you're in the ER and the doctor comes in and diagnoses you with, oh, this looks really bad.
Yeah.
That's a big one too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or say an athlete getting injured, and like in my situation with the back, being told, oh, you can't dance, like your career's over, like which I was actually told, like, oh, you won't be able to dance professionally after this
Yeah.
because this is, you won't be able to get that range of motion in your back again, or it wouldn't be smart to move this way again. Even going back to the, after the horse accident, right? Like being told,
Mm.
oh, you're fragile, you're weak, this is really bad, you have to modify this and you can't do this again because, your body's, weakened, right? Like what is the impact of that?
I mean, yeah, and I had something similar. I do acro yoga, which is like
Yeah.
acrobatic partner yoga. And yeah, I mean, my doctor was like, you can't do this for a long time. And like that is a huge part of my life and my community in Austin. And I really love acro yoga. And so like that was really hard too, because it was like, oh well, now I can't do the thing I love. So, okay, now I'm even more isolated, don't have a car, can't get
Mm.
places by myself. And then, I'm in pain. And so, I mean, I was definitely like depressed for a while. And it was challenging because I mean, I don't have a partner. Like I am kind of on my own, not like actually, like within the
Right.
context of the universe, but it felt like that. And what was also great is that there were times I would go to acro and just sit and watch, and it was just like, I just need to get out of my house and go do something. I'd bring my heating pad and plug it in and sit against the wall with my pillow and my heating pad, and just like, okay, I wanted to be part of something, even if I couldn't fully participate, because I know from knowing GNM for a long time that that isolation piece and feeling like you're doing it all alone can cause more issues. And yeah, so just see if I covered everything because yeah, just really, really fascinating. Um, all the lessons and just how my life has shifted in so many other ways. I mean, even doing this podcast with Abigail, it's like I've had it in my brain for several years now that I've wanted to do a podcast. And, you know, and I didn't really know that I knew I didn't really want to do it by myself, but having this other experience that was okay, I see how the universe is supporting me and all these actual people in my life supporting me, and I don't have to do everything myself. I don't need to be so independent, and actually being hyper independent is not it's not really a strength in the
Especially
way
for a
that
woman, for a
yeah,
female, like
exactly.
yeah.
Like we're taught that that is a strength, and I'm not saying that it's not in some contexts, but like the ability to actually ask for help and receive support actually shows a lot of strength. And right, as women, biologically, we are made for relationships and community. And so doing things all on your own is actually not even like biological. And so I'm like, well, hopefully I learned all my lessons from that. Never know. Um,
Yeah.
oh, I did want to talk about one more thing that was funny. So just talking about the spine health. So I mean, I've been working on this for years, just speaking up for myself. But something that was also really interesting is, with the self-evaluation conflicts, that you're stronger once the healing is completed. And I was like, oh, I'm also gaining a backbone, right? Not just physically, but it's like I'm learning how to more efficiently and lovingly stand up for myself and ask for what I need without feeling guilty or feeling like what I'm asking is too much, whatever that means. Um, and literally having a strong spine, a strong backbone that I'm sure years of years of conflict activity where I physically and mentally didn't. And so to now feel stronger physically and to just be more able to stand up for myself is amazing. And um yeah.
Right. I love that. And I think, it's so beautiful to me, just kind of wrapping up how in GNM, the language of our conflicts, of our adaptations, the different nuances and flavors of conflict, it's so beautifully metaphorical, right? Like, with the spine, you're gaining a backbone, learning to revalue yourself, to stand up for yourself, to be able to ask for help from others. And I also, and we'll probably get more into this when we do the episode just on like self-evaluation. We can, go more into the different types of flavors and nuances of specific conflicts. But, when we say self-devaluation, that's a really big overarching theme. And there are many ways that this can manifest and show up for people. And, when we say, like when Ashlee was talking about the kind of general flavor of the low back specifically, because as we know, every part of the body is, symbolic. Like there's a reason why the adapted tissue is happening in the low back versus the leg versus the neck versus the arms, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we have to look at And when Dr. Hammer did this research, I think he was getting at, okay, this is what it seems to be. This is kind of the flavor of conflict. But in my opinion, there's still so much research that needs to be done. I think that he got the like general theme of it. Like, yeah, it's self-devaluation, but I think there's still a lot of disagreement, if you will, in the GNM world. Okay, what specifically does the low back signify? And I think that there are many different flavors and ways of
Mm,
interpreting this that's not necessarily the same for every single person. So just, know that there is an element of this where you will have to figure out your unique flavor. But in general, the low back, why do so many people have chronic low back pain? And in
hmm
my opinion, I mean, like Ashlee was saying, that the conflict is definitely along the lines of feeling bad about yourself in terms of needing to feel supported. But what's even deeper than that is feeling like you're not enough. Because
Yep.
if you didn't feel like you weren't enough, then there wouldn't be that conflict of, oh, well, then I need support from others and I feel bad about needing support from others. But even deeper than that is that, like, I'm not enough, right?
Yep.
I'm not good enough. I'm not strong enough. I can't. Also, you'll hear it commonly talked about, like, I can't, that like the weight of the world is on me and I can't bear it all. Like I can't,
Yep.
I
Unbearable.
think, yeah, and also for the hips too. I think, like, I can't bear it. I can't handle it anymore. I can't handle this weight, anymore, or whatever conflict you're dealing with in your life. That, I think that that can play into kind of the, to help people understand how, low back pain and adaptations in the low back can look. It doesn't necessarily need to be the specific conflict about feeling like you need support from others or feeling bad about needing support from other people. There are many different kind of flavors and nuances that go along kind of the same general theme. But I think that there's still a lot of work to do in this field in GNM, a lot of research to be done on, okay, can we get more specific about this actual flavor of conflict? So
Yeah.
is there anything you wanted to add before we wrap up?
Well, I would just say to like anyone that's listening, and maybe you're having chronic pain or any other type of self-devaluation conflict, or you're dealing with an injury, a recent or previous injury. Like, how can you come to peace about it, about the current symptom you're struggling with, or an injury that you've had in the past that maybe now you still have,
Yeah.
lingering problems you're dealing with? And, what does that look like? Because with every conflict resolution, in order to have this, perceptual or practical resolution, it means that like the conflict can't happen again, or not in the way that it happened, because you're different. You're a different
100%.
person. And you're not going to be the same person, even if that, you know, same situation were to happen again. You would respond differently because you are different. So what can help you get to peace? And, what support, or what do you feel good about supporting yourself with? Because we're also not saying that, you know, any therapies or anything, like doing any of that, is like bad or wrong, or that you should
Mm.
just,
It can
oh,
be
you
very
should just
helpful.
bear the pain.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
like, what's going to be most supportive for you as an individual?
Right.
And that might look different than, maybe what you've been told, or maybe that your family thinks you should do, or your friends. But really paying attention to your inner self, and what would feel good. Like, would getting a massage feel
Yeah.
supportive, even if
Mhm.
that's not resolving your conflict at the biological level? Will some of these other things support you to getting to that full resolution, and finding what works for you, and not necessarily getting stuck on that thing is the answer? um because that's where, people can kind of run into trouble sometimes. But, finding those things that work for you. and doing them. And then also, you know, when you're getting massage or going to chiropractor or, you know, going to physical therapy, can you see and think and notice your thoughts of like, I'm doing this to get stronger, and how can you go towards more of what you want instead of I'm doing this because I'm broken or there's something wrong or I need to be fixed. And this person or this therapy is going to, quote, fix me, which we know is not true because you're not broken. Even if your bone is broken, you're not broken.
That's so
true. Yeah, so those two things, like find something that works, that's supportive, and then also use your mind and the placebo effect to the nth degree and help yourself during those supportive therapies, whatever that is for you, so that you can get to that resolution more easily and quickly.
So thank you all so much for being here and for listening, and just step into the energy of having already found your resolution. And, you know, if you're dealing with an injury, something, you know, chronic pain related, something that seems to be at least related to an injury that's like not healing, you know, can you shift your perception to view yourself as not broken, as not weak, as not fragile? Because when you look, right, when you look at what your body's actually trying to do through the lens of GNM, you're going through that adaptation to build back up as even stronger than before. So it doesn't mean that you're going to, you know, be in this weakened state forever. And I think so much of, you know, this cycle of chronic pain, at least I know for me that I got stuck in, was this perpetual hopelessness, right? Like, oh, I'm broken, I'm weak, I'm never gonna, you know, XYZ, right? And so I think stepping into a place of possibility and resolution, seeing your conflict is already solved, what would that feel like? What would that be like when your, you know, injury or chronic pain or whatever is healed? What do you want to do with your life? What are you going to spend your time doing? So I think, and then everything Ashlee said too, absolutely true. So yeah, we hope that you found this episode helpful, and that it will change the way that you're looking at, you know, the world around you, right? The lens through which you see the world, and that you can hopefully better understand, you know, the topic of injuries and chronic pain, and, you know, that you can maybe see it from a slightly different point of view.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.
We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. We appreciate you being here.
If you would like some additional support in navigating your health symptoms, we both provide coaching services from a German New Medicine perspective.
Our Instagram handles and personal websites are linked in the podcast description.